Welcome to the Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century from the periphery. I'm your host, Jure Ayub, and my goal is to use this platform to connect with activists, scholars, writers, and other weird folks from around the world to link our stories and interests up. Join me as we get into all sorts of futurisms, from solar punk to degrowth, as we explore meaningful ways of creating links between the peoples on the periphery, and as we explore various topics from tech to anti-authoritarian politics, feminism, abolitionism, decolonialism, anti-racism, and all the other fun isms in between. This podcast is ad-free and accessible to everyone thanks to the generous donations of Patreon supporters on patreon.com/firethesetimes. For as little as $5 a month or $50 a year, you can help keep this podcast independent that way. If you're a student, unemployed, or in any kind of financial difficulties, you can support with $2 a month or $20 a year. There are also other methods such as on PayPal or buymeacoffee.com, and you can find the relevant links in the description below or on the website. My goal is to make this project financially sustainable so that I can work on producing valuable content on a regular basis, such as this podcast, the newsletter, my essays, various online resources, and hopefully eventually YouTube essays as well. And if you like the content of this podcast, you can also check out the newsletter. In that newsletter, which I release on a quasi-monthly basis, I reflect on some of the topics discussed on this podcast and try to take them a bit further. The newsletter is free and you can get it by simply subscribing directly on the website. The Fire These Times is named after the James Baldwin book The Fire Next Time, and the music is by Ibrahim Yusuf. Thank you for listening and take care. So this is a conversation with Dana Moss. She's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Notre Dame, and she's the author of the book The Arab Spring Abroad, Diaspora Activism Against Authoritarian Regimes, which you can find in the link in the description. As you will quickly find out, this topic is pretty close to my heart. It parallels my own experience in many ways, although she primarily focuses in her book on Yemeni, Libyan and Syrian diasporas in the US and in the UK. We kind of had a broader discussion on why diasporas are still undervalued. We went into stuff like impostor syndrome, survivor's guilt, things that many of us I know feel pretty frequently, and so on and so forth. The main argument, I suppose, is the fact that diasporas are not homogeneous. In fact, they change all the time, and if you listen to this episode in 5 years or in 10 years, there might already be things that feel a bit out of date. And that's something that I want to emphasize, and probably emphasize more in upcoming episodes. There is a tendency of either grouping the diaspora as sort of like the same thing, any diaspora of any group of people, but also underestimating the impact that those diasporas can have, not just on what you might call the host countries, or it's a problematic term, but also on their home countries, which is again also a problematic term. I think you get the gist of it though, so I will leave you at that, and as always, thank you for listening.
So much for having me, Joey. My name is Dana Moss. I'm an assistant professor of sociology and a faculty fellow at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame here in Indiana, USA. Okay, so we'll be primarily talking about your recent book, which is called The Arab Spring Abroad, Diaspora Activism Against Authoritarian Regimes, with the subtitle. Can you tell us a bit about the book? What is it about and what motivated you to write it? Sure, yeah. I'll start with sort of the story about how I even got involved with learning about diaspora activism in the first place. I, just by sort of happy coincidence, started my PhD work in sociology in 2010, and I was really interested in studying social movements and mobilization and rebellions in the Middle Eastern region. I'd spent some time in Yemen. I'd spent time studying Arabic, and I was really also very distraught by the kinds of narratives that were coming out of the region. And particularly, from the U.S. side since the war on terror and the invasion and occupation of Iraq. So I was very interested in this, but, sociology tends to be a very Western and American-centric discipline in a lot of ways. So the response that I got at the time was a lot of times along the lines of like, well, are there social movements in the Middle East? I mean, don't we know that this is the one part of the world that sort of escaped the third wave of democratization and perhaps people there are happy with dictatorships? There was this kind of this sense, I'd say, with the exception of fabulous sociologists like Asaf Bayat and Charles Kurzman, that there wasn't much going on. There wasn't much to look at. And then, of course, a few months later, things erupted in Tunisia and Egypt, and we see what became known as the Arab Spring revolutions explode. And so automatically, in one way, my whole research career and agenda was validated. And on the other way, a lot of the places that I had intended to visit and do field work in, like Yemen, all of a sudden became off limits. I mean, even though I had connections there and I had a visa lined up and this and that, the only place I could get to in 2011 was Jordan, which was a wonderful experience. I learned a lot doing research there. But the point is that when I returned home to California in the fall of 2011, I was sort of like, well, all the action's over there and I can't be there to do the kind of fieldwork that I wanted. And now what am I going to do? And through some work that I had done, some activism and organizational work I'd done with this group called the Yemen Peace Project, which was co-founded with my spouse to educate Americans about what was going on in Yemen, we became aware primarily through Twitter and some other murmurings that were going on at UC Irvine, where I was going to school, that all of a sudden all these diaspora protests and celebrations and picnics were going on almost literally in our neighborhood, literally in our backyard in a lot of cases. Among the diaspora. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. So let me just go and see what's going on. So I started just hanging out, sort of getting invited to different events, getting to know people who are in the diaspora. And we're very, I'd say, a mix of hopeful and excited and very motivated to help their compatriots back in the home country, but also especially in the Syrian case, I would say, very fearful about what was going to happen. And it was just through the wonderful sort of sense of hospitality and invitations that I got that I ended up spending a lot of time, particularly with the Syrian community around the California region. I ended up getting funding then to travel all around the States and Britain to interview activists and people who became mobilized for the revolutions across the US and Britain. And what was so interesting was that, I'd hear stories like, we've never been this active before. We've all been living with this hatred of the regime for decades, but we've never been willing to talk about it with each other, much less do something about it in the community. Or I'd hear stories that were like, we've never mobilized, to this extent in our history as an immigrant community, even though we've been here a long time, but also we're really disappointed with the outcomes. We didn't feel like we were able to help, for example, Yemenis back home very much. I felt like I heard a lot of stories that contradicted my expectations or my assumptions coming in as an outsider, as sort of a white privileged American researcher. And one of the, I will just end on this so we can get to other questions. But one of the things that, of course, surprised me the most was the fact that even when I was out protesting with Syrians who were standing on street corners in Anaheim or LA or Orange County somewhere going, down with the regime, the world needs to pay attention to what's going on in Syria. A lot of them were really scared at the same time to be photographed doing so, to be in videos doing so, to even have me around, because for those of them who didn't know me, even though I'd been invited to these events, they were pretty freaked out that, in my naive sort of graduate student fieldwork kind of way, I'd whip out a notebook and start taking notes or maybe writing down people's names so I wouldn't forget them. Essentially, some people and some women actually confronted me and were like, who are you? What are you doing here? And I had this moment where I thought, oh my God, I am so blind that, even though these folks are out protesting in public, they're still terrified of not only what might happen to them if they ever want to go back to Syria, even of surveillance or other kinds of things that are happening in their communities, but especially for their family members who might be trapped under regime control, and what might happen to their family members if they're seen online, saying down with the regime from America. And so this opened up a huge world to me and led me to begin a particular line of research on transnational repression, which we can talk about, and join with other scholars as well who are looking at this issue coming not just from the Syrian regime or the Libyan regime under Gaddafi, but under lots of different regimes in the world today, unfortunately.
Yeah, I resonate a lot with everything, and thanks a lot for this intro. This podcast, weirdly enough, sort of became a diaspora project in many ways. I literally started this podcast in March of 2020, I believe, which feels like ages ago now. But in the process is when I essentially decided, if that's kind of the right term, that I'm not going back, at least not for now. And So that kind of the very first episode was with a well, now she's a good friend, but at the time I just knew her as a Hong Kong activist in exile, essentially. So we had a conversation along those lines, and obviously many episodes were ended up sort of being about this in one way or another, even though I wasn't always sure of what this was really. But your story of people coming to you and at protests and being worried, this happened to me as well. Even while I was living in London, I was very active with the Syria community there, and because I'm Lebanese, and most Lebanese look like most Syrians, really. They did some were a bit worried. They didn't know me. I wasn't from the community really, so I did get some questions like, "Who are you?" and stuff. And being with someone from the community as well made it easier, and that was obviously a way of and I knew this. Like, I'm from Lebanon, so I did know this before. I obviously knew of the reputation of the regime. I had some cultural context, if you want. But yeah, the extent of it was quite something. And there is a sense of paranoia that exists among diasporas. And in Syria, there has been and there still is this expression that roughly translates as the walls have ears, essentially. And I think I've heard it elsewhere as well. And it's often used as shorthand, to describe how paranoid everyone had to be due to the Assad regime's repressive rule. And essentially, like, you always had to look behind your back. You could trust like immediate family members more or less, but maybe extended ones. It depends on the region, and there were always different calculations essentially that people who are in Syria, Syrians in Syria, have to make. And I kind of learned, and I learned even more with the book, of course, that this is something that people in the diaspora do as well. So I was wondering if you can kind of talk a bit about that.
Oh yeah, and I'm really interested in your experience too, Joey, especially as you're going through this process right now of
Mm-hmm.
figuring out where you fit in the world and your immigration experience and the fear and the uncertainty and the ambiguity around all of this. I think certainly I will say to one of your questions that you sent me earlier, this is still, and I want to put this out front for everyone, a huge problem.
Mm-hmm.
And a real problem, not just an imagined one, not just a kind of paranoia among Syrian communities across the world, but as with the Hong Kong diaspora, people from China, from Tibet, from the Uyghur, community, and all kinds of communities around the world. I think regimes are sort of totalitarian style regimes like the Assad regime is by its very nature completely intolerant of any dissent. So I think irrespective of the actual threats that diaspora movements may pose abroad, they're still going to be worried about them and they're still going to want to get rid of them or repress them or silence them or keep an eye on them to some extent because of the paranoid, intolerant nature of these regimes in and of themselves. But we also know through all these examples in history from, Vladimir Lenin and Sun Yat-sen to Ruhollah Khomeini and many others, Ahmed Shalabi in the Iraqi case, that sometimes diaspora activists, exiles who do mobilize abroad can pose a big problem for incumbent regimes back home. They can amass resources and money, they can lead revolutions. So regimes aren't totally just being paranoid or ideological and worrying about what diasporas do. And particularly in this era of human rights and international media and this sort of thing, although the human rights era is admittedly extremely new and extremely weak in many regards, I think regimes these days, and particularly ones that want to posture themselves as reformist and liberal and have the facade of democracy, are also very worried about their image.
Mm-hmm.
So what we've seen back, and this goes back over 100 years, but certainly since the rise of these hyper-nationalist or autocratic regimes like in Libya and Syria in the 1970s and 80s, that as part of their consolidation of power, two things are going on, or maybe three. One is that they're eliminating their enemies by killing them. Another is that they're forcing their enemies abroad, a lot of times purposely exiling people to sort of get rid of them as like a safety valve, a pressure release,
Yeah.
or just forcing people to flee. And then the other thing is that they're then worried that these groups and these insurgents and these different opposition activists who they forced abroad, who may have been engaged in peaceful resistance, or even doing something as simple as writing a poem, that criticized the regime, to actually engaging in an insurgency. They're worried about what these guys are going to do once they go abroad. So we've seen, unfortunately, a lot of what I come to call in the book and in some of my other writing, this phenomenon of transnational repression. And by transnational repression, my colleagues and I really mean any attempt by regimes to surveil, monitor, threaten, undermine, the ways in which people live abroad, work abroad, study abroad, and also to the extent to which they are able to, capitalize on their free speech, capitalize on their newfound freedoms and their liberties to maybe speak out about what's going on at home. A lot of regimes really don't like that, again, for the reasons that I mentioned. So, in some cases too, we've seen people embedded in diaspora communities who, for a variety of reasons, are reporting on what diaspora members are doing to regimes back home and to like various branches of the al-Mukhabarat, for example. So in 2011, the FBI, because of the emergence of a kind of new Syrian protest movement and the overt activities of some exiles who were there, the FBI got reports that the Syrian the Syrian resident, legal resident of the United States in Northern Virginia, was engaging in spying activities on the Syrian diaspora, folks who were just out in public, peacefully protesting, engaging in their lawful civil liberties, and then literally sending that footage, their names, their information back to the Mukhabarat and the Assad regime in Syria. And sometimes that could be used to threaten their families, to threaten them with exile, to say, you can never come home again if you keep engaging in this activity. And he was actually convicted and imprisoned for a little while for that activity. But, a lot of states aren't either aware that this is going on, or they don't really have the mechanisms to necessarily convict people for what's going on. So because people are aware that, well, there are people in my community who may not only be like loyal to the regime or be paid by the regime to spy on me, but there are also people who may be coerced, just like they are inside of Syria or Libya, to spy on me. Regimes a lot of times are very crafty. They'll say, well, you can go abroad on a scholarship, but you have to tell us what's going on, with your family, or you have to tell us what's going on with this community while you're abroad. And so a lot of people will say, well, like, if I don't write a report, how do I know somebody else isn't writing a report about me and then saying I'm not reporting, right? It creates this like completely terrifying Orwellian kind of experience that follows people abroad for these real reasons. And then, of course, regardless of what regimes are actually doing, the worry is that they're doing something that just can't be detected. So people are living, I think, in a lot of fear in general, whether or not this is actually going on or to the extent to which it's going on. I mean, those things oftentimes can't be known. So yeah, it was a huge issue. So, and what I found was so remarkable was that even though Gaddafi and Assad had pushed a lot of opposition activists, peaceful activists, civil societists, abroad, that the majority of them, and not only didn't speak out openly and publicly identifying themselves as opposition from abroad, but they specifically told their children not to get involved with these kinds of opposition politics, or if they did, to do so in with incredible degrees of secrecy. So what you had was a situation where not only you have the sort of anti-regime diaspora largely silenced out of fear, before the Arab Spring revolutions, but you also have a situation where the very few people who are principled or brave enough, or they've already, lost everything, where they're out speaking against the regimes, where they're quite isolated in the communities. I mean, a lot of Syrian students and others would tell me, we can't even go up and say hi to those guys, because what if somebody sees that, right? And then I could be associated and incriminated by association with this person. So it really, I think, made exile activism, all of this transnational repression made exile activism a very lonely experience. And people said, to the extent that, for example, we did have civic associations, the Syrian Association for this, or the Syrian organization for that, they were run or headed by regime loyalists or regime officials. So once again, you couldn't, speak openly in front of those folks. And I think for the majority of the folks that I talked about, the primary worry was not for themselves, but for extended family back home. Sometimes parents, sometimes siblings, so people who are very close, but even extended family. I think because of the privileges that people are afforded abroad, they said, I really cannot in this situation be responsible for the potential endangerment of someone back home. That's not my place. Now, we can talk about how that changed during the sort of the uprising period, because it did for a short period of time, I think, for a variety of reasons. But we see this going on in a lot of communities where you have maybe a couple of brave exiles who are very much being targeted by these regimes, and everybody else is essentially keeping quiet. And we don't want to, as outsiders, as Western researchers, to assume that, just because there's no big, powerful anti-Saudi movement or lobby in the United States, for example, that those people are automatically loyal to the regime, that they're brainwashed by the regime, or that they're apathetic, right? They just might be scared. They're probably scared to death to say how they feel or to express any nuance or political opinion about the regime that isn't just like MBS is the best, right? Because it's been demonstrated how lethal and how dangerous it can be to do this kind of work from abroad. And the last thing I'll say is just that I've heard, and since these stories have since been corroborated by other reports, unbelievable stories. I mean, almost unbelievable stories. They sound like they should be unbelievable about, Gaddafi's forces in the 80s and the 90s hunting these dissidents abroad, killing people in London, going after people in California or Colorado. And even though these, let's say, didn't happen, quote unquote, that frequently, I mean, it really only takes one or two attempts, right? Or one or two successful assassinations to send these shockwaves of fear through these communities. For many years, they'll say, well, remember so-and-so, right? And he was essentially butchered on the street as would a Mexican cartel to send a message, to the community that, you're never safe. You can't outrun brother, big brother Gaddafi, and your whole family might be screwed. And that's something that I think, like you said, so many people understand, they experience in their day-to-day lives. But as outsiders, I don't think we really had a good name for it or a way to conceptualize it. So I hope that, that's some of the ways in which I can bring sort of these experiences to the social science community to do some of this translation. Because I think it's hard for those of us who have a lot of privilege to understand these intersections,
Yeah, I've been even like wondering with myself like which terms to use. Transnational repression works very well for that purpose. Um, as it happens, as I said, like this whole thing is very much like a thing in progress happening with me, essentially. But something that I realized, and I mentioned this actually in the episode with Sharia Talerani on the Syrian prison literature, of how threats can work. And obviously with the Syrian example, it's significantly worse than the Lebanese example. But partly because in Lebanon, it's quote unquote not as bad, it can be very difficult to explain what I mean when I mean that there are certain threats or certain precautions that I must take, let's say. And I'm pretty open about this. Nothing is it's not really a secret or anything like that. But the main thing that most people I feel don't get until it happens, essentially, I think, or at least until it happens to someone maybe, um, is that most of the time you have no actual way to know how serious is the threat on yourself or on your family, for example, or friends or what have you, because it's not like any of this is official, unless there's an arrest warrant, that's a different thing. But most of the time it's just, from someone, or you've heard, or let's say the army put out some statement, but it wasn't very clear what they meant by that, and you don't have anywhere to go to ask, like, because as soon as you ask, you feel that you're already more visible than you'd like to be. There are different things, and obviously depending on the regime and probably the places where these diasporas live, it can vary from bad to worse, essentially. And there are lots of examples, and we'll probably get through them and stuff. But it's just something you started with, because there are well-known cases, at least, of famous people in the diaspora that have objectively impacted things, quote unquote, back home. You mentioned Lenin, obviously Sun Yat-sen, obviously Khomeini, of course, and probably many others. And yet, at the same time, I can't help but still feel that the impact of diasporas is often undervalued. It's just seen as as if like if you're Syrian American, maybe now your story is in America. Like your story now is the struggle. Like maybe you're struggling with racism against Arab Americans, or if you're Muslim, maybe Islamophobia. Like your struggle or your story becomes an American story essentially. Well, obviously, more often than not, it tends to be if they have two identities or more, then they have actually two stories or more stories. So I'm curious if you can talk a bit about that.
Oh, yes. No, I think that's an incredibly important and astute point, and something, of course, that you're living with now. Stuart Hall talked about people living with these hybrid identities, and now we talk a lot about intersectionality. We oftentimes, like you said, don't apply this to the realm of immigrant studies, and we don't apply it to the realm of sort of geopolitics or conflict. So when we think about conflict, we think about it as contained within the borders of the nation state. Maybe that conflict creates a refugee crisis, but that's seen as sort of a separate issue under refugee studies. Then you maybe study them in refugee camps later. But we tend to not think about these conditions or these relationships as traversing borders, as enduring over time within communities, between families. And I also think, too, that you're absolutely right, at least in my discipline of sociology, when you look at sort of the tables at our big conferences about where are we thinking about the intersection of immigration and politics, we think about it as contained within the host country, right? And like you said, the different levels of racism or xenophobia or Islamophobia that people are dealing with. And of course, they are dealing with those things. They're very important to look at. But when you think about the ways that, for example, Libyan Americans are not only dealing with the intersection of sort of this, the Trump's Muslim ban and Islamophobia and the war on terror, but also threats from the home country, and particularly in the early days of the war on terror, when Gaddafi, was making these moves to try to ally himself with Blair and with Bush, and to say, oh no, you can render suspects, we'll do this quid pro quo, I'll apologize for Lockerbie and all of that business, which ended up, when push came to shove, he ended up kind of losing all of those friends very quickly, and too much to his personal detriment later on during the revolution. But the point is that yes, and I think that what I see, for example, in revolution studies, in studies of the region, is it's very much contained by our assumptions about the importance of state borders. And of course, I'm not going to argue that state borders don't matter. They matter an incredible amount. As you said, the degree of difference in the level of repression or fear you might feel stepping into Syria versus being in Lebanon or being in Jordan, is huge. I mean, it's very, very important. But people's relationships, their ties, their ties to people, and also their ties to their histories, their autobiographies, the identities that they profess, simultaneously embed them in other sets of conditions, right? Like in home country conditions. And so I draw a bit on the book on Peggy Levitt and Nina Glick-Schiller's work on simultaneity, which is to really say we can't just parse this out and say, well, you're either home or you're abroad. You're either an immigrant or you're an immigrant. There's really this intersection that's happening. And this is what we see coming alive in people's experience, that it's really shaping the extent to which they can participate in what we might consider to be rather mundane acts of civil society or political life in places like the US or Britain, like even doing something like, as you know very well, raising funds for the victims of regime violence in a contested area in Syria is something that the regime would consider to be a traitorous and a treasonous act, and something that's worthy of repression. But here we'd say, like, yeah, it's just another fundraiser, right? Like, in other words, what's the big deal? That's like the least political, least activisty, risky thing you can do. Well, not so for Syrian Americans or people of Syrian citizenship, or even second generation, third generation Americans of Syrian descent who might be going back to these war zones to deliver aid to places that they feel this connection to. They live it on a day-to-day experience through their families, through what's happening online, through the information that they're getting, through their friendships. So I find that we really have to think about the context in which people are making decisions as very much a relational kind of context, not just a territorialized context, right? Like, even I will say, as very much an outsider, somebody who's not of Yemeni descent, I mean, for many years of my life, what's happened in Yemen has deeply affected me emotionally. personally, and sort of affected my decision making throughout the day about how I'm going to spend my time, who I'm going to talk to, what I'm going to do, even though I'm not at all connected to, but even though I don't have those like heritage ties, essentially, right? So I definitely agree. I think there's a term in the social science called methodological nationalism, which is a critical term to say we really need to break out of borders, these like sort of nation state borders, as the primary way that we construct how we think about the human experience. And I think your question gets exactly at that, at how limiting it is. I also say, I noticed that in human rights reports and other things, when we talk about conflict zones, a lot of what the diaspora is doing is incredibly important. I mean, there have been a few reports that say that what the Syrian diaspora across the world has donated to people in need, the internally displaced, to children, to those affected by trauma and war crimes, what the Syrian diaspora has donated and given back to their home country is far greater, even in dollar amount, than what nations have been providing, and in part because they can fill in the gaps where the international response is falling short. We know that the regime has been stealing aid. We know that the regime's been blocking aid. The Syrians, through their connections, have really been able to fill in some of these gaps and provide literally life-saving support. But a lot of that isn't either officially counted because it's done through these unofficial remittances or these kinds of clandestine remittances. Although the World Bank does count unofficial remittances, which is important, but it's unclear sometimes whether that's going to a kind of humanitarian cause or a political cause versus just helping someone to buy groceries or pay a bill, right? So there's that. But I also think, like, again, when we're focused on war or focused on exactly what's happening in the conflict zone, so much of what I learned about what diasporas do takes place kind of in the background, but it's absolutely vital to the effort because as far as I know, any insurgency or any protest movement that's going up against the kind of enemy regime like Gaddafi, Saleh, or Assad is going to need a lot of external backing, in order to survive. And so the diaspora plays an absolutely crucial role in a number of areas. The book talks about how they broker. So they basically provide the kind of linguistic and relational connections between people at home and people abroad to get them resources, to get them attention, to introduce them to politicians, to introduce them to Anderson Cooper on CNN or Jon Stewart on The Daily Show, back when he was running The Daily Show. They do a lot of broadcasting work. So they will literally translate what's going on in the home country and broadcast it out to social media, and sometimes themselves be the ones who run websites and run other sources of reliable information where they're trying to tell people what's going on in areas where there's no independent reporting or where it's really unclear what's actually happening. Of course, they remit, as I mentioned, material aid, cash, diapers, food, water, all of that sort of thing. Sometimes they'll go and lend their skills directly to volunteer along conflict border zones and refugee camps, and also in the conflict themselves. So we've seen, for example, Syrian doctors. There are a lot of Syrian doctors and surgeons and dentists in the United States, and so many of them have not only been lending sort of medical supplies and fundraising in that way, but they've also actually gone into liberated areas to do emergency surgeries, trauma work, and the likes. The Libyans did a lot of that as well. So there are all these ways that they contribute, but I think either they sort of get, in outsiders' viewpoints, blurred in or sort of mixed into what's going on the ground, or they're ignored because they're performing this kind of brokering role. And what a lot of activists told me directly was look, I don't want to be the voice of the revolution. I don't want to be the face of the revolution. I'm here in California. I'm here in New York. I'm here in England, right? My job is to connect you as an outsider, or connect the inquiring media organization, or to connect, the charity with people on the ground who directly can speak for what's going on, and that kind of support, which I found very admirable too. I mean, the diaspora is very self-conscious. I'd say, if I could generalize, people are very concerned. They don't want to be seen as leading. They don't want to be seen as speaking over the people at home. And by and large, that was a huge concern. And I think people were also very self-conscious, and they were very worried that people at home would come to blame them or come to feel that they were competing with them. I mean, most of the people I met and talked to, the vast majority said, like, it's really not our job. Our job is in the support role. We are the support staff. So just, I'd say probably, if you can extend the metaphor, that just as like the nurses don't get credit for successful surgical procedures, so too do the diasporas oftentimes not get credit for the kinds of life-saving work that's being done on the ground, the kind of journalism, the kind of humanitarian aid. But they're absolutely 100%, I'd say, critical. And that's, again, why states are so concerned with like what they're up to.
And like along those same lines, one thing that's very common, at least that I found, and I think your book actually touches upon this as well, is there's definitely a sense, well, I don't know how widespread it is, but definitely many people in the diaspora, whether they are like first generation, second generation, whatever, would have this sense of either like imposter syndrome or survivor's guilt. They kind of come together often. And the only reason, so I started obviously feeling this in the past couple of years since I left Lebanon. The only reason I haven't beaten myself up too much about it is because of my relationship with a bunch of Syrian activists who are also in exile and have been in exile for a while. Because when they were going through, well, what you basically could describe as survivor's guilt, I was the one telling them, well, you shouldn't think this way. It's not, obviously it's not your fault. You're not responsible for this and everything, which is of course true. But then when it started happening to me, almost no one could give me any kind of the same. Basically, it's obviously always easier to give advice than to receive it, right? But I'm very curious about this sense of just this feeling of survivor's guilt, of imposter syndrome. Have you kind of seen it with some of your people you've spoken to and so on for the book?
Oh, 100%. And I would say this didn't really make it so much into the book. It's something that I'd like to write about in the future. Is really, I think that people in the diaspora a lot of times are at least experiencing secondhand trauma. And like you said, part of that trauma is survivor's guilt, which we know is a huge phenomenon. I was just reading this morning about oral histories from the Holocaust, right? And survivor's guilt is a huge theme. You also see this with some research I'm doing right now with veterans of the American War in Vietnam. I mean, survivor's guilt runs through the whole thread of people's accounts and narratives and their feelings when, especially when they were in country and in combat or potentially exposed to danger, and they lost people along the way. And this is really not just a sort of post hoc experience, but a continuously lived experience for people, knowing that there are still not only maybe their family members who are still in a particularly precarious situation or an uncertain situation, but also just that their whole national community is elsewhere, that they're apart from them, that they're not suffering or experiencing with them. What I tell people is that, it is so important for members of your community to be safe and to survive. I think that what we've seen is that a lot of times the survivors who escape and go abroad can, like I've just mentioned, play a really important role when conflicts reemerge, when crises reemerge, even if it's just, for example, like something that feels relatively depoliticized, like a natural disaster, like an emergency stemming from climate change, right? Even then, the diaspora can step in and play an absolutely pivotal role. So I say, like, without people abroad, there's a much smaller chance that people at home can survive these kinds of crises, honestly. And that's one of the reasons why immigration and remittances get so much research attention. It's because the people who are abroad a lot of times are literally propping up families and economies back home. So there's that sort of very practical part to it too. But on top of this sort of secondary trauma and guilt, I also see a lot of people still suffering from the trauma that they maybe endured when they lived back in the home country. And that's not necessarily just from, being thrown in prison and tortured, though a lot of people certainly were. It's from living in a kind of society where you are being terrorized by the state day in and day out, where, as you mentioned, there's an incredible degree of uncertainty. You don't necessarily know who you can trust. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I think that in of itself, and as I've heard from different Yemeni refugees who live in the United States and around the world, has been incredibly difficult. And I will say, just by the way, because I don't want to forget, your situation to me sounds a lot like Yemenis who have had to go into exile. More so much than Syria or the Libyans, because like you said, and as you know better than I do, there's an imminent threat to them a lot of times, right? It's like you have to go to survive. That's the only option. In the Yemeni case, it's been much more ambiguous. I mean, certainly there are people in exile and as refugees right now who have been imprisoned by the Houthis or persecuted by the Saleh regime or what have you. But there are also people who were just like, this is feeling very uncomfortable. I'm not sure that I can live a life here. I'm not sure that I can have a career here. I'm not sure that I can have a family here. I believe, I'm human rights through and through in my work and my writing and my poetry and my art and my, whatever it is. And this place is not a hospitable place for that. So when they do go abroad, the sense of, well, whether they had to leave or not is maybe a little more ambiguous because they made a very rational, logical, understandable decision, but it wasn't necessarily because they were like, their life was directly at threat at that moment, if that makes sense. Maybe it is, right? But like you're saying, sometimes you just don't know. And so I do see a lot of grief. There's a lot of grief involved with this guilt, a lot of mourning for what might have been or could have been. And again, like you said, even though none of these situations are these folks' fault, and again, I've just been thinking about this with these Vietnam veterans I've been talking to for a separate project, there is so much internalized sense, I think, in a way to reassert one's potential agency in a situation where that's like almost completely out of your control to be like, well, what could have been, what could I have done? What should I have done? It's always admirable, I think, when people try to extend some sense of responsibility for their situation because they want to make things better and they want to help and care for and protect for the people that they love. But on the other hand, it's also the case that you're really in a kind of prisoner's dilemma. There are no good options necessarily in this case. And I will say again that I do believe strongly from this research that people who survive abroad are not necessarily the ones laying down their lives in particular conflicts and crises, but they can play an absolutely life-saving, life-giving, life-supporting role from the outside. And I know that so many Syrians are so traumatized and exhausted and burnt out, and I think like just completely emotionally fried that that's not something necessarily they want to hear at this point. But it's certainly something that I've thought a lot about because now you have, and I know you know this from your other work, a new wave of Hong Kong exiles coming in and confronting these same questions, like what's our role from the outside? How can we help people on the inside? Do we lead? Do we not lead? And then they also have that guilt, right? Because it's a very similar situation to yours in that it's like, why not might not necessarily be on the death list or a blacklist, but I'm at risk to some extent. And what am I going to do with the rest of my life? I mean, these are major choices. And when we read back to World War II, there's always that like reflex about being like, why didn't people leave sooner, right? Like, why didn't more Jews in Germany leave before they were rounded up, in the 1930s? And it's like, well, gosh, in those moments, you have such strong ties, you have roots, you have conflicting social pressures, and a lot of times you don't know and you cannot predict what's going to happen. So people being caught in all of these different kinds of conflicting pressures and situations, I almost feel like there's no good or logical response. People are doing the very best they can with the situation and the resources that they have. And I think the diaspora can play a tremendously supportive role so long as they are doing it in collaboration with people on the ground who need their help. I think that's when we see diaspora as being the most effective and also maybe the least problematic. I mean, I think, there was this like very, how should I say it? Like difficult situation with Ahmed Chalabi in the Iraq case.
In
the United States, for people who don't know, I mean, he was one of the people who had been on like the CIA and State Department payroll for many years, trying to get the United States evidence, that they could persecute the Saddam Hussein regime, which used to be their ally. And it's very, very messy. But the point is, he was sort of blamed as legitimizing U.S. Invasion, occupation of Iraq, and for all those atrocities and this sort of thing. Now, one of the problems with Chalabi is that he had a disproportionate amount of support and influence on US government policymaking. He was telling things people wanted to hear. I mean, his grievances against the regime were legitimate, but he was also maybe making a deal with the devil also. And so diasporas do find themselves in this role where it's like, okay, well, if the only folks who are going to help me are these like former Western colonial powers that are really controversial, that's a problem. If diaspora members are kind of, if a small select group of diaspora members have the ear of policymakers, but they're not speaking to anybody else in the diaspora or listening to anybody else in the diaspora, I think that can be a problem too.
Yeah, I mean that brings my next question was actually going to be about this, how there's also a tendency of homogenizing the diaspora as like, if there is a similar-ish enough experience, therefore everyone who has had that experience is at least to some extent, you know, uh, I don't know, have the same belief or have the same values or whatnot. But I had a lot of episodes on this. One recent one that comes to mind is an episode I did with Christopher Wong on the legacy of Tiananmen Square, and he was talking as a Chinese American specifically of how there's a lot of confusion in his view actually on what happened in Tiananmen. I mean, most people kind of know the basics, except like conspiracy theories, which is a different thing. But like most people sort of have a general idea of what happened, but like the details are a bit blurry. And every year, with every remembrance, something, depending on where it's being remembered. For example, a remembrance of Tiananmen in Taiwan is very specific compared to remembering it in the US, for example. Because, well, in Taiwan, many Taiwanese feel that this is an ongoing threat, it's not something that's quote unquote in the past. And so there's a lot of these examples. And so I'm just curious if you can talk a bit about how the diaspora members, at least if we might call them that, um, like just the diversity of opinions or diversity of views, and how, because I mean with the Lebanese it's not as strong because for the most part, maybe like the Yemeni case, there wasn't a single regime to flee. Or I mean, it depends. In Yemen there was at one point. So I think in the Lebanese case it's a bit different. It follows like, and it's also older than many other migrations, so it follows certain migration routes, and there are different dynamics happening, which is maybe a bit too much for this episode. But yeah, because I know from Syrians, for example, as an obvious example, that many Syrians in exile are opposed to the regime. Probably, I mean, from the polls that I remember, most of them are, but not all.
Right.
And there's always that percentage that sometimes are in the same communities, maybe in the same neighborhood, at least at the very least same city or same country for that matter. And this can create sometimes real tensions, like we have seen physical tensions, physical fights in some cases. In most cases it just becomes, you sort of know who's who, or you suspect who's who, and so the dynamics of this whole wars have ears can also reproduce itself in many ways in diaspora. So if you could talk a bit about that.
Oh, 100%. Absolutely. So, one of the things I talk about in the book that I hope will get more attention because it speaks to what you're talking about in terms of the need, especially for outside researchers and observers, to disaggregate and understand the diversity of people within a given national group or diaspora group. And of course, we sometimes use diasporas to refer to ethnic groups, like the Jews, or we think about them maybe as national groups like the Syrian diaspora. But as you said, there's so much variation and variety within a given diaspora group. Just to name a few of the basic ones, of course, we have those who are kind of loyal to the regime for various reasons. I've met, I think over the course of my travels and trajectories, people who are kind of die hard in the wool loyalists. And then there are people who are maybe not loyal, but they've learned that it's in their best interest to say that they are, or maybe just to not say much politically at all, because it's so tricky. It's seen as so toxic. And yeah, so that was very interesting. Of course, whatever's going on in the home country is really going to exacerbate a lot of these tensions and a lot of these potential social conflicts people have. And I call that conflict transmission. So when you have a case of conflict transmission, for example, for a long time in Yemen, you've had a big fight going on between different factions in the south who want some kind of autonomy or re-independence of the south, of South Yemen, which used to be its own sort of socialist republic, for those who don't know. And then those Yemenis who are for unity, for the unity of the Republic of Yemen, sort of the way the borders are today, where North Yemen and South Yemen became one. And so for many, many years, you had kind of pro-unity Yemenis and you had pro-Southern independence or secession Yemenis who, by the way, did not want to be called Yemenis. They wanted to be called South Yemenis, so they made sure to tell me we have our own identity. Is that these folks not only, had these kinds of verbal disputes back in the home country, sometimes even much worse than verbal disputes, but in the host countries, when they go abroad, a lot of times these conflicts transmit over. There you have this conflict transmission where you have people who are very much divided by their political beliefs and their sort of prognostications about the future of the country, and they cannot sit in a room together and raise humanitarian aid or talk about necessarily like what the future Yemen should look like, because they cannot fundamentally agree on history and they can't fundamentally agree on some of these basic principles about whether they are even part of the same state and whether they are a part of the same diaspora. So you find an incredible degree of heterogeneity within these groups. And in addition, like you said, you've got sort of loyalists or people who at least perform loyalty. You have people who are very vehemently against the existing, regimes or governments. You have folks who are very much not wanting to get involved with politics because they're sort of brokers or bridgers or business people in the community and they want to have good relations with everyone. I also heard a lot about differences between generations. So generational styles of running social movements, of running an organization, you might have like the elder elites, like old school folks from the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria or elder tribal elites from Yemen, and then their kids who are like, no, we do this differently. Like we believe in pluralism. We're like part of the independent youth movement. We're not allied with any of these old kind of movements or elite sectors. And we want to do our own thing. But then how do we do that without the support of part of the community, Or another big one is, of course, issues over feminism, which we see across all movements, not just Middle Eastern ones. I want to make that really clear. But what is the role of, women-led organizations, women's issues, even LGBTQ issues, which can be very controversial. So, you see sometimes a lot of splits between people on all of these dimensions, sometimes multiple dimensions at once. And then the question is, well, how do we continue to mobilize, even if, we put the loyalists aside, and we say, okay, we have this anti-regime sort of core or group of people who are very open about it and sort of closeted about it, but nevertheless, they want to contribute. They want to do something to help, even if it's just writing a check, or donating cash or whatever. How do we keep those people engaged and together and mobilized for the same issue when sometimes they're very much divided on the details and very important details, right? Like which region of the country should receive our aid? Which factions of the opposition at home deserve our support or deserve our vocalization? Which people on the ground do we partner with, and talk to and work with on a daily basis? So all of these kinds of conflicts that emerge within the home country, I find, depending on people's ties, do transmit abroad, and they can create the same or similar kinds of cleavages and factionalism and just tensions between people, which can make diaspora mobilization very difficult. So the more tension you find and cleavages between parts of the Syrian revolution, as we might say, in the home country, the more you're going to see that abroad. I also saw that in Yemen. Now, of course, no movement is perfectly unified, but I will say that the Libyan diaspora was probably about as unified as a social movement can be, considering that there's always going to be some underlying tensions, competitions, mistrust, and differences of opinion, because they had a unified enemy. They kind of had a unified, relatively, I don't want to overstate that case, but, they had a transitional government to support that they could back. there was a fighting force on the ground. They had clear allies. I mean, there were clear lines in the sand.
Mm-hmm.
And so people could fall on either side of that. Most people fell on the anti-Gaddafi side, and everybody was pretty darn unified until things fell apart later. When you have all these new sets of cleavages, differences come out and become really salient. I think it's much easier when people have a unified enemy, a unified target. And then once that target goes away, then you see on all different levels, people start to split up again, which is also why now you don't see a very strong or unified Yemeni American movement for what's going on in Yemen. Now, let me be clear, because a lot of these folks are my friends and I'm paying attention to what they're doing, and so much of what they're doing is incredibly admirable and important. Some Yemeni Americans are doing day in and day out work to try to help people in Yemen, and particularly to address the famine that's going on. Mm-hmm. So I want to make that very clear. But you've seen a lot of Yemeni American mobilization against the Muslim ban from Trump and against American government discrimination against Yemenis, but not vis-a-vis the war. And that's because so many people are divided on like the Houthis and the Saudi intervention and what's going on in South Yemen, and like who's actually in charge and who should be in charge. And there are really no good guys in that situation, as far as I can tell anyway. So it's made solidarity really a difficult thing to achieve abroad, which then I think also plays into like a feeling of helplessness and hopelessness and survivor's guilt. And like people in Yemen are suffering so terribly and we're here abroad and we feel like we can't do much. That's a sad thing to see, because you know that it's coming out of a very genuine sense of care. I mean, it's just devastating.
There's so much to be said there, and it is very interesting. I've definitely seen, or at least in my context because I lived in the UK for 4 years, and there I saw a interesting dynamic or differences, I would say, in different dynamics, in the sense that like how British Libyans might respond, or Libyans who are in the UK who may not be British, and how Syrian Brits have or against Syrians in the UK. And specifically with those two, because those are two that I was most involved in, there was more or less of a unified front. When it comes to Syria, yes, there was a sizable percentage that is like loyalist to the regime, or at least would say so, though they're by no means the majority. But I think it's kind of this untapped field of kind of looking at these different dynamics and maybe how they even interact with one another. There's lots of anecdotal stuff I can think of, because I've been more or less active for the past decade. I mean, I started with the Arab Spring more or less. And there are certain things I just remember being even like transnational across the Arab world. So like an obvious one would be the chants, obviously, Sha'bi Rida Scott and Nizam, other stuff that will kind of cross borders a bit easier with the internet. And there were also certain things that I can think of. For some reason, I'm thinking of Egypt, because I remember being in Jordan with a bunch of other Arab activists, some of whom have been in exile. Others just came to visit. There was like a meeting or whatever. And we were watching Bassem Youssef at the time. Obviously, most watched Egyptian TV host and so on, before he was effectively exiled himself. And there was this sense that, at least I felt it, that we were participating in something that felt a bit historic, and we were just watching TV essentially. Nothing was happening back then, or at least what when I was there in Jordan. But there was a weird transition phase, 2012, 2013, 2014, around the coup in Egypt as well, which obviously the current regime is still in place. And there was a sense of like, this is almost dying out. There was something like it's like the early phase of the uprising, which now we're calling it the early phase of the uprising. At the time was just what was happening as of now, or so far, that it was, I don't know, it felt a bit fleeting, let's put it this way.
Yeah.
And so I noticed this, but I was never able to put kind of like a word for it. And yet we see the difference between, for example, Palestinians in the diaspora, because it's such a long story by now, at least 7-8 decades. There are differences in dynamics and I'm saying diaspora, it depends obviously in the country as well. But between that and, let's say, recently, since 2019, with Lebanese who are abroad, or Lebanese Americans, Lebanese French, and so on, because the uprising in Lebanon, which has become this new focus for a lot of people, the October 2019 uprising, um, is very recent. Obviously, it's literally less than 2 years ago, over 2 years ago now. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that there are these different dynamics, and
Yeah.
then they're not easy to parse all the time. And probably it's easier to tell stories about them rather than to just write like bullet point summaries about them, which is why I'm kind of rambling about it. But it is something that I've definitely noticed. And it's been, well, we're talking end of 2021 now. It's been 10 years, a bit over 10 years now since the Arab Spring started, uprisings. And since then, we've seen a lot of, well, bad stuff happening to a lot of people in the diaspora. You have some, like in my case, that are, I would say, relatively mild. And because I try to be objective with this, I don't want to overstate what I'm going through. But obviously, you would have more extreme examples like Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul being murdered by MBS.
Yeah.
And you have other cases where it's very, unfortunately, very symbolic, like Sarah Higazi, Egyptian activist who unfortunately took her own life in I believe she was in Toronto, definitely in Canada. And this was a result, as many people who knew her, and I didn't know people who knew her, a result of what she went through in Egypt. So it was also, and also I should say, the difficulties of integrating or at least living in Canada later on as well. And there are
Mhm.
so many different examples. Well, one I want to mention because I'm going to interview him at some point. Iyad al-Baghdadi. He's of Palestinian origins, and he's now in Norway as an exile. He had to live in custody for quite some time now, because the Norwegian authorities got word from the CIA, I believe, that the Saudis may be posing a threat to him. And so these are, I chose these examples, myself included, just to show how do you say this, how diverse those experiences could be. They range from, well, this is manageable, I just need to be careful, and I need to maybe not go back as often, or maybe I need to take certain precautions, or maybe I just make sure that no one can hack my phone, that kind of precautions, to, well, this is urgent, and this is there's a threat on my life, I need to go into hiding or what have you. Or, of course, in the case of Sarah Higazi, is living with things that for the most part had already passed or had come to pass, but are still extremely difficult. And then there's a whole conversation about support networks and that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, talking really, what you're really bringing into sharp relief, which is so important in so many ways, is a couple of things. One is that the ground upon which people can find sanctuary is shrinking, and a lot of times it's
Exactly.
shrinking, not only because of conflicts in the home countries, but because of this horrific degree of xenophobia that has only escalated since the COVID-19 crisis, and really is even blocking a lot of vetted, legitimate, what we say, like already legal refugees from living safe lives where they can not just survive but thrive
Hmm.
in their new countries. We also see, as you said, people are dealing with so many different layers of uncertainty and trauma. I know Yemeni refugees who, when Trump was in power, the temporary protected status situation in the United States for them, where they could remain in the United States because of war back home. There was a long question for a while about whether that would be extended for Yemenis, and then their families are stuck in France, or they're stuck in Europe, and they can't, or Egypt, and they can't access them, and they don't know when they're going to see them. That alone would be enough, on top of the fact that people have already, dealing with the traumas that they've dealt with from war, from imprisonment, from sexual assault, from all of these different things that have happened in their home countries. Maybe in Europe it's slightly better, but I know that here in the United States we have almost no kind of general mental health support. Much, and you see that in the various crises that come up in the United States, from shootings to whatever, veteran involvement in far right groups, all sorts of things. And so much less for refugees, much less for students and asylum seekers and people who are making some kind of decision to go abroad, maybe not as asylum seekers, but just to get out, because of their politics and their beliefs and the environment of uncertainty. there's almost no support for them. And I think one of the things that I really hope to do, and my colleagues and I are working on this right now, we're putting together a whole volume of experts on transnational repression in partnership with some of the folks who work at the US-based think tank Freedom House. They put out some fantastic reports on transnational repression. They have another one coming up, and we're all really trying to bring this topic at least to the attention of policymakers, of law enforcement, of even governments and agencies like ICE here in the United States that may be complicit, accidentally or on purpose, with regimes that are attempting to imprison, block, persecute, whatever it is, their opponents who have gone abroad. And I can say a bit more about the Interpol situation if you want, although it's not my primary area of expertise. That's a really important topic. But the point is to say that, it's probably somewhat well acknowledged among those who care that people who go abroad have various levels of trauma or adjustment that they need to make psychologically. But I think, like you said, it's always suggested that that's past history and not a lived present that they're dealing with. And we need a lot more attention. Specifically, one place that might be very receptive to this are universities. Universities are very much, of course, I'm a professor, and I'm like, what happens at the university is really shapes a young person's life. And what's so unnerving is that regimes are mobilizing student groups to be very loyalist. They're sort of putting their consulates and embassies, having them keep tabs on student groups. You see this in the China case. Foreign Policy did a big piece on this, and really, universities should be a safe space. They should be places where people can write with and gain support for and deal with their traumas and feel safe and protected, rather than under siege in this very scary way from regimes that are concerned that they're going to get all these ideas about freedom and democracy and then cause all this trouble. And so one of the things that my collaborators and I are going to be doing is putting out a volume with Edinburgh University Press in the next year or two. We're under contract now to do it on transnational repression, and specifically to educate, policymakers, administrators, educational institutions about what's going on for some of these folks, so that at least they can be aware, at least they can start to take hopefully some proactive measures, not just reactive ones. And like you said, especially with the Khashoggi case, poor Khashoggi and his colleagues had no idea the extent to which the Saudi regime had tapped into their phones, knew their whereabouts, knew their plans, because they're able to use this cutting edge technology that they can purchase from private corporations and states, Israel, Italy, all of these places, sometimes in violation of international agreements and international, conventions on human rights. And I think we're very much on the back foot in terms of recognizing the problem and being proactive about protections. And right now, as you suggested, the onus is very much on the victim to try to keep defending themselves or protecting themselves, where really you're up against sometimes an entire state, and all their trolls and all of their technologies and all of their resources. And that's not fair. That really needs to change. So I'm hoping to be a part of, if a group of folks that we can work with and be in dialogue with activists, with diaspora communities, with law enforcement, and with universities and other places to really increase the potential safety of these groups writ large, rather than dealing with these really severe cases on sort of an ad hoc basis, and then lots of people sort of fall through the cracks.
Do you have a title for that book, or can people already look it up, or not yet?
Not yet, but it will be submitted. The whole thing will be finished this coming year in the late summer 2022. It's going to be called Transnational Repression in an Age of Globalization. Okay. So if anybody, is interested in reading some of what's going to be in that book and expounded upon, definitely check out Freedom House's report. They just put out a really good new one that's very comprehensive called Out of Sight But Not Out of Reach. And that primarily talks about the ways that people are, exiles are being assassinated, they're being kidnapped, they're being renditioned. A lot of times what regimes do too is they place what's called a red notice on their political opponents to alert other countries who are members of Interpol that they're a wanted criminal or they're a wanted terrorist. Now, Interpol does not actually have the capacity to issue international arrest warrants. That's sort of the mythology of Interpol. But other countries oftentimes, like the United States, often treat Interpol red notices like an arrest warrant. And in cases like of ICE, a lot of times this has been used to put, civil society activists, legitimate asylum seekers, to deport them or basically put them in internment and detention till it can be quote unquote figured out. And Interpol doesn't like me saying this, but they do not have the capacity to do what they're mandated to do, which is to check these red notices and to make sure that they are not being issued for political reasons. And Syria is now just being allowed to rejoin Interpol.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a travesty of enormous proportions, because obviously they can now, use Interpol for the purposes of transnational repression even more so than the kinds of things that they were engaged in before. So that's a huge problem. I mean, every regime on planet Earth has been using the excuse of the war on terror quite successfully to do these kinds of persecutions. And there are amazing attorneys and human rights organizations and civil society organizations working to counter this, but it's like a reaction. It's not a prevention. And I don't necessarily know what the solution is, because Interpol is also very important to catching international criminals engaged in human trafficking, child trafficking, all that stuff. So the solution probably isn't to get rid of it. It's to actually fund it properly so that they can have the support staff to actually check what's going on and who are these red notices being issued against, so that they're not being abused in this way. I mean, that's probably the most pragmatic way to go. I don't know.
I'll
But
definitely
it's
do. Yeah, I'll definitely do something on this Interpol matter recently, especially because the most recent. I mean, the new appointee, basically, he's a member of the Emirati government as well, and there's a lot of questions around
oh
that.
god,
And
he's
there's
an
a,
Emirati.
he's an Emirati official, yeah.
Oh yeah. Well,
Yeah,
there you go.
yeah.
I mean, the UAE is a primary purveyor of transnational repression. So
Exactly. So there's already been, and he was like explicitly. I'm spacing out of his name now. I mean, people can just Google Interpol president, but
yeah.
yeah, he was explicitly mentioned by name by a number of I think 18 human rights organizations when he was a nominee, basically telling Interpol not to nominate him. And there's at the very least two people that have testified to have been personally tortured by him.
Oh my
And
god.
there are one is a British academic, I forgot his name, and another one is um, a I forgot where he was from, but he was arrested in the UAE for wearing a Qatar football shirt. I remember back when the tensions were high between Qatar and the rest of the Gulf. There's a lot there, and there's an ongoing developing story that I'm sure is going to be investigated further and more. And I'll probably do an episode on this at some point.
Yes, and I know a lot of folks who know a lot more about the specifics of Interpol abuse than I do. So I'd be
Hmm.
happy to
Sure, yeah.
put you in touch, because this is a huge issue. On the one silver lining of this is that it's kind of one of the issues that the U.S. government's actually interested in doing something about. Not only because they are a major, probably I think the major funder of Interpol, but they're also very concerned that some of their Cold War-esque political enemies, like the Putin regime, or whoever, are abusing it, and potentially harming Americans. So at least we have some attention on this particular kind of international organizational abuse against, diasporas who are just trying to, again, survive and gain some degree of minimal protection abroad. But it's just the tip of the iceberg. Of course, the abuse of Interpol red notices is hard enough to prevent, much less, emailing or issuing threats over social media that can be
Hmm.
anonymous, stalking, kind of doing these other forms of intimidation that I think are a lot cheaper for regimes. They're a lot cheaper for loyalists to enact. They're probably a lot more common as well. And they're just much harder for authorities to either be aware of or do anything about. So, but we really have to take these seriously, because, as you said, they shape people's mental health, their lived experience, their families, and whether or not they're able to travel
Hmm.
and do other things. So it's a huge issue. I'm hoping that it gets a lot more attention because again, as these maybe as we start to think a little bit more transnationally, it's like, oh yeah, well actually people are living these transnational lives, and regimes are also working transnationally to repress. And this shouldn't be a surprise to us anymore, particularly with the Khashoggi case. And Allah yarhamhu, but his bravery and his situation has really brought this attention to the world in a way that I don't think most people would care about. So hopefully we can really honor him and value his work and his activism by making people more aware that it's not just him, right? This wasn't just an aberration.
Yeah, no, definitely agree with that. Is there anything else you wanted to kind of get into before we get into the book section?
No, I think that we've covered a lot.
Yeah, we
It's
have.
been
Yeah.
great. I
All
love
right.
how conversational it's been, though. It's been really fun.
Thanks. Okay, so if it's okay with you, can you recommend 3 books to our listeners and briefly explain why?
Okay, so can I be really cheeky and can I please recommend 3 on the region and then 3 on transnational repression?
Yeah, you can do that.
Oh, thank you, Joey. I appreciate it. Okay, so for those who are interested, if you're interested in the diaspora's role and everything that's been going on with the Arab Spring uprisings in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, my book's the book, I guess. But if you're interested more in reading really good work that relate to what's been happening in the home country and also how it's been impacting refugees, I have a few to recommend. I think Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War is an absolute must read. It's by Rabin Yassin Kassab and Leila Al-Shami. I think the most updated version is 2016, but that will give
Hmm.
you a really beautifully written, nuanced portrait of just how diverse the Syrian revolution was and a lot of the things that sort of fell apart for revolutionaries and why. So it's a beautiful book, easy to read. I think anybody who is interested in like what happened there and what's going on in Syria, that's a really good one.
I'll just quickly say it's kind of funny because I was speaking to Layla now, and
Huh,
we're very good friends, and she's going to be a guest soon at some point probably. I mean, it's one of those things that I just haven't planned it properly because we speak every day, and I forgot to actually
well,
re-invite
please
on.
send her my regards and tell her that I recommend this book to everyone. And I cited it shamelessly and copiously in my own book because it is such
Yeah.
a well documented, well substantiated, but also highly readable account of the war and of the uprising, which was so admirable in so many ways. Another one, of course, that's very easy to read and again very heart wrenching. Also, is We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled: Voices from Syria
Hmm.
by my colleague in social science, political scientist at Northwestern, Wendy Perlman. That book has gotten a lot of attention. It's won a lot of awards, I believe. I mean, it's just a beautiful oral history of Syrians' experiences in the war and in exile. And it also touches on how the fear of transnational repression, the fear of the regime travels with them
Yeah.
and is part of their trauma. So, I mean, I think that's a beautiful book. Another one that I absolutely love, I mean, I made everybody read this, like from my mom to, whoever, is by it was the best book of the year by the New York Times. It's called The Return: Father, Sons, and the Land in Between by Hisham Matar, who was a son or Libyan exile,
Hmm.
essentially. And his father was hunted by the regime, disappeared by the regime. This is one of the best books I've ever read. And it talks about him going back to Libya after, during, like you said, during this moment of transition where things were uncertain to see if he could find out what actually happened. Absolutely gorgeous book. Another one on Yemen that's fantastic because poor Yemen always gets overlooked so often is Marieke Brandt's book, Tribes and Politics in Yemen, A History of the Houthi Conflict. I'd say the title sounds a little dry, to be honest, but it's an absolutely excellent sort of accounting of the war and what's going on, and which has produced the world's worst humanitarian crisis. I'm really sorry. I think that's 4 books, but I'm
It's okay.
still going. Okay, I still
Go
have a
for it.
couple
Go for
more.
it.
Okay, so Sean Roberts, who's going to be contributing to the volume on transnational repression that I mentioned that I'm working on and editing, he just put out a book that Foreign Affairs voted as like a top book of the past year, and it's called The War on the Uyghurs, China's internal campaign, against a Muslim minority by Princeton University Press. So I haven't read it yet. I'm really looking forward to it though, because, and again, it speaks to not just the internal Chinese state repression of this Muslim minority, but also its global dimensions. And he's really going to be unpacking that more in what he's writing with us. Two others, and then I promise I'll stop, that are really great on sort of the transnational dimensions of repression and dictatorship and authoritarianism. One is by Alex Cooley and John Heathershaw, called Dictators Without Borders, Power and Money in Central Asia. And some of the regimes that they're talking about, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, these regimes are some of the top purveyors of transnational repression. So their book, Dictators Without Borders, is really, really important contribution. And the last but not least, I have to give a shout out to my colleague and friend, Alexander Dukalskis. He just put out a book this past year called Making the World Safe for Dictatorship, which is again on how different regimes enact transnational repression, targeting journalists and citizen activists abroad. And it's not a light read. It's not very hopeful, but it is really, really important to looking at how regimes like China, North Korea, and Rwanda are actively targeting and persecuting dissidents abroad. So again, thinking about this not just as a sort of a Middle Eastern authoritarianism kind of problem, but as a global problem. That not only involves governments that we in the West consider to be authoritarian or autocratic, but also the ways in which Western governments and different democratic governments are sometimes complicit in these kinds of actions, I think is really important for our awareness and understanding.
Amazing. I mean, everything that you mentioned also, I always say this, that I will include this in the description and on the blog post as well, of course. Diasporas, thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you so much, Joey. This was an absolute delight, and let's talk again sometime.
My pleasure, definitely.